Howdy and good morning. We have for today Romans chapter 13, one of the great texts out of the New Testament. Paul is writing to the Roman congregation. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay all of them their dues, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. Well, there's so much here that we could spend a week on it rather than a few minutes on a Tuesday morning. This does not happen in a vacuum, this kind of thinking. This came out of the great tradition of Judaism, and the most clear articulation of that comes from Jeremiah. Jeremiah, of course, is predicting to the people of Judah that they will be hauled away into Babylon as slaves. And he says something quite startling. He says, when you find yourself in that country as slaves, pray for the welfare of that city, municipality, whatever. Pray for the welfare of that city, because in its welfare lies your welfare. If God sends plagues and pestilence and famine and drought and armed conflict, you're not going to be presumed in a hermetically sealed cocoon. You're going to suffer it, probably suffer the worst of it. Pray for the welfare of the city, because in its welfare lies your welfare. Fast forward to the time of Paul. Paul is quite ironically writing as a leader of an unlicensed religion in the Roman Empire. If he's captured and interrogated and found guilty, he can be killed. In fact, it's pretty sure that Paul was eventually executed for precisely that thing, being the leader of an unlicensed religion in the Roman Empire. And yet here, it's almost startling that Paul says there is a proper function for civil government, in that God protects the innocent from the ruthless, and in that government, God provides for the common good. He doesn't articulate it quite as clearly and extensively as Augustine would a few centuries later, but he does articulate that understanding coming out of the great tradition of Judaism. By this time, there are Jewish communities all over the Mediterranean basin, and their job is not to overthrow whatever government is in Corinth, or whatever government's in Alexandria, or whatever government is in Spain, and turn it into a Jewish republic. Their goal is to work and pray for the welfare of the civil government. In its welfare, in the city's welfare, lies your welfare. That's how Christians, who are 80% of the population in the United States, can put up with a civil government that is at best non-sectarian and at worst radically atheist. We put up with it on this understanding, but there are, of course, limits. Christians who put up with the Nazi regime have been roundly criticized. Christians who cooperate with communist regimes are often criticized. There have to be limits when the government dedicates itself to evil, or when a government dedicates itself to the eradication of Christianity. We have to pull back. We are not quite at that point in the US of A. And so you can be a good patriotic American, and be a good Christian at the same time, but there are some limits. Have a great day. God bless.